false teeth, and a string of sausages. You promised you'd tell me about fishing. Grandad was sitting in his wheelbarrow, a bucket of potatoes between his knees, cutting them in half for planting. You got me into trouble with that other fishing story, he said, about your grandmother's jawbone. Tell it to me again. Not likely. Oh, all right. I'll tell you a story about fishing years ago, but you've got to keep it to yourself. I'll keep it to myself. Better. I promise. Grandad looked at me. Years ago, we used to row out into the Rangitoto Channel, catch a lot of snapper. Big ones. What did you use for bait? Your old snapper. He's great one for mussels. You pull a thread out of a sugar bag and tie a mussel on your hook so he can't get away with it too easy. That makes him so angry, he bites hard, and then he's hooked. What's the biggest fish you've ever caught? Something once took my line out so fast that it smoked where it ripped through the water. Your line's catching on fire, Granny shouted. Next thing, the line burnt through, and I lost my hook and sinker. What was it? A bite that big could be anything. Whatever it was down there, you couldn't hold it on a snapper line. So I plaited 3 heavy hapuku lines together. The only trouble was, I didn't have a hook big enough. So I sharpened my false teeth on the grindstone. For a hook? Grandad nodded. I baited my false teeth with a dozen mussels, dropped the hapuku line over the stern, and was a bite twice as big as the first. Grandad jerked his hand. I was too scared to look over the side. All we could do was hang on while it towed the dinghy stern first up and down the Pacific Ocean. A row we made going through the water meant you couldn't hear a thing. Of course, your grandmother was making a fair bit of noise with her screaming. We whizzed over the equator, so far north, the North Pole stuck up out of the top of the world. Then we turned and whizzed south till the South Pole stuck up out of the ice. Whatever it was, turned again, towed us halfway to South Africa. Then towed us halfway to South America. Oh, must have been going fast. Fast? The water boiled along the side of the dinghy and stripped it of the paint. Gee. In the end, the thing I'd caught came up, lay on top of the sea, and water poured off its back. Shark? Grandad shook his head. Bigger than a shark. A whale? Shook his head again. Bigger than a whale. What was it? I was just going to row across and unhook my false teeth out of its mouth when there was a yell from your grandmother sitting in the bow. She'd copied me and put over a plaited hapuku line as well. Did she put her false teeth on for a hook? You know your grandmother never admits to having false teeth. What had she caught? Something enormous, she screamed, and next thing we knew, we were being towed, bow first, up and down the Pacific, halfway across to South Africa, halfway back towards South America. Did she pull it up? Get a move on, I told her. I want to have a look at what I caught. But she took no notice. She never does. Up it came, lay on the surface, and water poured off its back. Was it as big as yours? Grandad picked up a potato and looked at it. What was it Granny had caught? Grandad cut the potato in half and dropped the pieces in a bucket. What I'd pulled up, he said, was the North Island. You pulled up the North Island? Of New Zealand? That's what I said. And what did Granny catch? You know her. Always has to go one better. She pulled up the South Island. Is that true? Go and ask her if you don't believe me. Where was the North Island's mouth? My false teeth were hooked into what's Wellington Harbour today. What about the South Island? Where Nelson is, your grandmother's false teeth were hooked in there. So she did use her false teeth, I laughed. Shh! Grandad looked around the garden. But what bait did Granny use? A string of sausages. Grandad looked at another potato, cut it in half so each half had an eye, and dropped them in the bucket. Is that true? It took a couple of weeks for the water to pour off the backs of both islands, and when it finished it had carved out the valleys and left the mountains standing. Oh, I thought it was somebody called Mahy who fished up New Zealand. Oh, that's another fishy story. How do you know which one's true? Grandad looked at a potato. I suppose it depends on who's telling the story, and who you want to believe. I'm going to ask Granny, I said, and ran up to the house.